So, my name is Peter Hawks. I'm Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, and I'm honored to be here today to introduce the second event in the newly inaugurated Provost Colloquium series. Our speaker this afternoon is Professor Bill Broun, who has taught in our English department since coming to ESU 10 years ago. Bill Broun is the author of Night of the Animals. Now, I forgot to ask, how is everyone doing today? Is everyone having a good day? Is anyone having a bad day? I have a friend, and when I tell him, Nathan, I'm having a bad day, he says, well, things could be worse. Then he says, and they are. And so that's really what Bill Broun's novel says. Things in the future are going to be even worse than they are today. So Thomas More wrote a book called Utopia, which imagines a world set on an island where communities share a common culture and way of life. It's a vision of an ideal society. And Night of the Animals offers the opposite. It's called a dystopian novel. A dystopian novel shows how utterly rotten the society will be. So about the future described in Bill's novel, just how bad is it? Well, in the year 2052, England is bleak, bleak, and more bleak. It is plagued by social and economic inequality. The British class system is heightened into basically a two-tiered system. The poor people, called indigents, are kept separate from the new aristocracy by the Red Watch, a policing arm of the government. So basically, this is a police state, and it's also a surveillance state using the latest computer technology to watch people. Horrible penalties are in store for those who transgress. And much of the population is pacified by Flot. Flot is this addictive hallucinogenic drug that sounds very good, actually, but has terrible, terrible side effects. So in this terrible, bleak atmosphere, we have a leading character, which is Cuthbert Hanley. Now, Cuthbert is not the usual hero. Cuthbert is poor, he's overweight, he's homeless, he's a drug addict, he's an alcoholic, he's mentally ill, and he's 90 years old. So Bill, if this becomes a movie, I don't think many of those leading men in Hollywood want to play Cuthbert. A lot of makeup. So how many of you have pets? Raise your hand. How pets? How many of you talk to your pets? Okay. So Cuthbert believes he's inherited the ability to communicate with animals. So he talks to them, but they talk back to him. So he hears voices. And the animals themselves have not done well in 2052. Everyone remembers the biblical story of Noah's Ark. And God told Noah he was going to punish humans with this tremendous flood. Noah was instructed to gather 2 of each animal, build a ship, and put them on it. So London Zoo in this novel can be seen as an ark for animals who are being driven out of existence. Few animal species exist in the deforested, barren, and poisoned planet. And London is threatened by suicide cults bent on destroying all animals. So Cuthbert comes to believe that he needs to free the animals in the London Zoo. So that's the central action. And the other part is, when Cuthbert was 6 years old, he lost his brother, and he blames himself for that. And the voices tell him redemption can be found by freeing the animals in the zoo, who will then lead him to his missing brother. So Cuthbert tries, but the police oppose him, and the suicide cults bent on destroying the world's animals along with themselves. So can Cuthbert release the animals in the London Zoo? I can tell you without giving away the ending that we readers are on Cuthbert's side, even though we may question the sanity of someone who can talk to animals and hears voiceless. So this is a cautionary tale set in the future. Look at what humans are capable of doing to each other and to animal populations. But the novel is also a story about loss and grief and possible redemption. Now, what's really great is Bill Broun's novel is published by a major publisher. It's been reviewed by major newspapers, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Manchester Guardian, and so on. Bill was interviewed by Scott Simon on NPR. Nancy Hightower of the Washington Post writes that some have called Bill Broun's Night of the Animals prescient. The book's plot indeed dovetails nicely with some recent events, Brexit and terrorism, which he predicts. So Bill has written a timely novel with wide appeal. Now, just a personal story. It took 14 years for Bill to write this novel. He's been here for 10, so the major part of the novel was written while he's here. On page 452, Bill gives me credit for giving his novel a legitimate place in his work life. So thank you, Bill, for that. Then I found my name, Mr. Hawks, on page 147. And I remembered Michelangelo painted the Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel. And it was the Pope's, one of the Pope's functionaries, the master of ceremonies, was a person he didn't like. So he put him in hell with jackass ears and wrapped a snake around him, eternally biting off critical parts of his manhood. So I looked very carefully at this passage. Certainly there are differences. I'm Dean, Mr. Hawks in the novel is headmaster. But Cuthbert was mildly disciplined twice by Mr. Hawks. And the report resulted in Cuthbert's father beating him half to death with a belt and a heavy gauge wire coat hanger. So the novel puts all this weight on transgressions, and Mr. Hawks reported 2 of them. And so I've been thinking a lot about this, and I'm still thinking, Bill. Page 147 verses 542. All right, so just a reminder, books are on sale in the bookstore. And first we're going to have Bill read a passage from his novel, and then he's going to talk about what it's like having a novel published today. So let's give a warm welcome to Bill Broun.
Thanks everybody for coming. And thank you to Provost Bruno for hosting me here in the committee. I feel really grateful. I'm also really flattered to have President Welsh here too, so thank you. And my colleagues, my esteemed colleagues, thank you. There are a lot of different sections to read from the novel. I really appreciate the introduction from Peter. Is really it does a lot of the work that I would have had to have done now to explain things. And Hawks, just a good English name. That's all. It's just a good English name. So, I mean, it's the kind of thing that happens when you write a book. You kind of run out of names to sort of use, and you just start grabbing at anything that's floating around in your head. So I have to say that's coincidental. And when I heard it, I was like, did I do that? It was because it is sometimes like that. Also, when you're writing a novel, especially a really long novel, it has a lot of layers and a lot of worlds. And in fact, that's probably the hardest thing of writing a really long novel is keeping track of everything. It's hard to keep track of all that's happening. And And that, I think, is probably the biggest challenge of any kind of long fiction, keeping everything in your head. It has to be like an orchestra that you constantly hear, and you constantly hear every part of it. So it's kind of like that, I'm going to read a passage that, some of you have heard my readings before, so I was going to come up with something a little bit new. And I'm going to read a passage that is sort of towards the middle or towards the beginning of the book where Cuthbert is remembering his childhood. And he's writing about going to visit the grave of his grandfather. And there's been a problem with the grave. And he's going with his family. His family is this working class family from Birmingham. And they drive out. They kind of make a day of going to visit this grave. They go to this old country church. And I can tell you that a lot of this is based on the truth, on things that really happened, It's inspired by, I should say. So, and it uses the namesake of the book of the protagonist, Cuthbert, who is named after Saint Cuthbert, this ancient British saint. So this chapter is called Green Saint Cuthbert, the Wonder Worker. And I don't think it's too long. I think it'll take around 10 minutes, 15 minutes. So. Cuthbert saw his monstrous father weep for the second and last time in his life when the family, father, mother, and himself, took a harrowing trip to visit his grandfather's grave, which his parents hadn't visited for 2 decades. And I should say this is happening in 1970, and also that Cuthbert is newly alone as a sibling. The year before his brother had died. And so he's kind of alone and in grief, in terrible grief. So, it was around 1970 or so, 2 years after Driston's vanishing during the trip to the auntie's cottage, 2 years after he fell into Dowell's Brook and was saved by an otter. Granny had been bedridden often at that time, he remembered, and he'd had to swear to his father not to tell Granny about the excursion. It was a rare moment of sensitivity on the part of his father. It would break her heart, his mother had explained. She's buried this part of the past, and it shouldn't be opened again. The Handleys had driven southwest from West Bromwich, which is part of Birmingham, in their aquamarine Hillman Imp through Dudley, Netherton, Quarrybank, and Lye to the other side of the Black Country, past Stourbridge and Kitty, and once again to the narrow, jobless old lanes of the Wyre Forest. Even though Alfie was his father-in-law, Harry Handley had revered the man he imagined, the soldier, the self-starting farmer, the morning drinker, far more than his own father, in fact, who still lived in a caravan senior community in Stafford, where he was curiously renowned for his excellent orange peel rock cakes. If you end up as aft the bloke as Alfie Wenlock, Henry was telling his son, you'll make the old man proud. But he wasn't your father, was he? Cuthbert remembered asking that day. And Gran says he was gentle. He was very sweet. He was a sweet and gentle man. Ha, said his father. He was a right hard man. Cuthbert recalled how they careered up to an ancient Norman church, St. Cuthbert's, his namesake, parking in a gravel semicircular drive. They were less than a kilometer from the Wyre Forest. There was the greenest grass he'd ever seen in the driveway's center. The day was blue and clement, with splashy sunlight and swifts circling the square bell tower like hot, torn electrons. You're going to learn a thing or two, his father told them, smiling, almost skipping up to the church. He was in a rare good mood. Your granddaddy's in the oldest church in this part of England. The sexton, a very thin man with white hair and thick white eyebrows, had shown them a jumble of misshapen stones mortared into an inside wall. Stones, he said, from the old times church. The Normans had built St. Cuthbert's above. An elaborate oak chancel screen near the altar was covered by the faces of men with foliage growing out of their heads like halos. Oak and ivy leaves poured from their mouths. Some of the faces cried leaves. Eventually, he took them into the crypt to examine a book of burial records. The book, as he called it, was kept in a modern steel strongbox in a desk that seemed unused and dusty. It took a long time to get the volume out and placed solidly upon the desk. There was a smell of frankincense. It's Alfred Whiston Wenlock, you say? Alfred Whiston Wenlock? Died 1933, answered the father. The sexton began looking through the pages. Handley, Handley, he said. He settled on one page and ran his thumb down a long column. He peered close, putting his face nearly against the paper. But he suddenly pulled away, almost jumping back. He scrutinized Cuthbert's father. He seemed boldly nervous, shaking his head, frowning. He began flapping through the large, grid-covered pages again, but he was hardly looking. It was strictly for manners. Then he stopped. "There's a matter," he said, and Cuthbert to this day remembered him repeating the exact phrase, "a matter." "Your relative's plot cannot be located precisely," he had said. "The old lane, see?" He licked his lips and looked down. Cuthbert's father was still smiling gently and blinking. "The old lane," the sexton said, "the one that runs beside the churchyard, where there's that stone wall, see? It was dangerous. It was so narrow, see?" The face of Cuthbert's father was reddening and his smile had gone. "The council had to widen it, and we'd had to sadly move a few of the unmarked graves." "Cannot be located," Cuthbert's father bellowed. "What?" The sexton took off his green plaid cap and kneaded it with his fingers. We only moved them as we found them, but where we could find them, mind you. I'm afraid a few of the sites, quite a few, there was a mishap with the backhoe and the builders. They removed some soil they shouldn't have, see? We just didn't know where the plots were afterwards. Not anymore. It's always the poor who suffers, isn't it? Cuthbert's mother had said, "We're not poor." The sexton continued, "Of course not. But the graves that got moved, they were the ones under the statue of St. Cuthbert, the wonder worker, the graves of people who didn't have much money and abandoned people, and the paupers' graves and such. Half of them are still under the statue, we suspect, and half of them, see, are under the new road. I'm sad to say, no one ever visited, see?" The sexton turned his cap over and over in his hands. He set it down and sorrowfully set the book back into the strongbox and clasped the lock. He looked aggrieved, but not ashamed. There was a flat look on Cuthbert's father's face. Then he screwed up his eyes and started to weep. "You bloody bet I'll complain about this," his father said, snorting, waving his arms around. "Hank," Cuthbert's mother said. "I'll go to see the fucking Archbishop of Canterbury," Henry continued. "I will." The sexton nodded as if he thought this was a plausible idea. "And I don't blame you, sir. I couldn't," said the sexton. "I just couldn't." Eventually, without saying a word, the family had trudged out to the churchyard and walked over to have a look at the statue. They could look at that. The sexton trailed behind them, standing at a respectful distance. He stepped forward at one point and ushered the four of them toward a neat, plain, pretty corner section of the churchyard, the remainder of the pauper's graveyard. White and pink campion flowered on the grassy mounds. On a thick pedestal, plated with bright green copper, stood the weathered figure of Cuthbert. Over the years, acid rain from the Black Country had given the statue its green patina of copper sulfate. The saint was represented in flowing bishop's vestments and a mitre, says St. Cuthbert, bending over to lift a hank of marble cloth up his leg to let a sea otter comfort him. Two short-haired otters, which looked oddly like fox terriers, stretched at Cuthbert's feet. The otters were of a brown painted bronze, the same color as the soil, and the same that he had seen near the wire forest on the day Driston went away. The legs of one of the otters were off the ground, clasped angelically, its paws holding a small cross. Cuthbert had nearly frozen himself to death while Standard, this is Saint Cuthbert, had nearly frozen himself to death while standing in the North Sea to pray, and God had sent the otters to warm and dry his legs. Henry Handley gave the statue a tortured look. At the time, it had seemed quite clear to Cuthbert that both otters and the saint had come straight from heaven. The animal, the human, and the divine were all part of the same. He recalled Granny saying that long ago. Her own father had trained an otter to fish for eels and roach on the Stour and Severn rivers near Kidderminster, and had made the townspeople jealous. Cuthbert's father and mother both claimed it was impossible, but to Cuthbert it did not seem impossible at all. Granddad's watched by the Green Man, Cuthbert told them that day, just like Driston. Oh, Jesus, said his father, if only the fucking vicar would have watched. Hank, said Cuthbert's mom, grimacing at her husband, the boy, please, not here. His parents looked destroyed that day, but Cuthbert, bruised inside and out, actually felt very proud. He still recalled how he had rubbed one of the otter's heads and said, magic. To Cuthbert, his ghostly granddaddy was as well marked as he could possibly be. His lost body, folded into deep England, was being both guarded and marked by St. Cuthbert and two otters that had traveled between dimensions. This was far better than any headstone, better than religion, better than his parents, better nearly than England. That's all. So I usually don't read for a really long time because I feel like I don't like readings that go on that long. And so I was going to talk to you about just the experience of, because I think it's something I always wanted to know, what is it actually like to publish a big novel these days? What are the things that are maybe surprising, and kind of how does it happen? The novel was, the novel has been critically acclaimed. That's one thing I can tell you for sure. It was the thing that was kind of a shock to everyone, including the publishers, I have to say, was that it got starred and boxed reviews in all the pre-publication journals. And that was very unexpected. That was not something people would thought it'd be a little quiet sort of literary publication, but it's kind of a loud literary publication. It's been an interesting experience. And so then it got tons of newspaper coverage too, feature stories. And the publicity team at Echo Books was just kind of overjoyed. They were really happy. The publisher it's an imprint. Echo Books is an imprint of HarperCollins, and I'm telling you this partly because when I see an author read, I always feel like there's this kind of wall. And I'm not really allowed to know about the publication stuff, and I'm not really, it's supposed to be kind of magical and sort of mysterious, but it wasn't at all, It took, the writing, of it took 14 years, and I thank Dean Hawkes, specifically because he actually let my writing be a part of my, it counted as part of my work here at ESU, my academic work. My creative work got to count for something. So in other words, creating something, innovating, it mattered. It counted for something, even though this book, the manuscript, which was thick, Andy McClanahan read it when it was going through. I kept sticking it in these folders. I'm like, for tenure, promotion, stick it in there, throw it in there, throw it in there, and I was waiting for them to say, well, when's the darn thing going to get published? Well, eventually, what happened for me, I was able to get to an agent who almost instantly, fell in love with it, and it had been rejected by probably 100 agents before in a different form. I had written it one last time. There was that. I drafted this book from start to finish 3 times, okay? And I actually started it in around 2001, 2002. And when the final draft was done, I knew I was at a point in my life where I could not do any more of it. Like I couldn't keep working on it because it's a sacrifice to the family, it's a sacrifice to my work life, it's everything. I would spend summers, everyone would be going on these really cool holidays, and I'd be using the money to pay for childcare so that I could go upstairs and write, in this, down in Easton, and I felt like a lot of times I didn't get to spend as much time with my son, and I felt like it was all that stuff, all the usual kind of sacrifices that anybody makes to do anything. I was like, I can't take it anymore. I'm gonna give it. I'm gonna see if I can get an agent one last time, and I got it to the right agent. It just happened to be one of the best agencies in the world. One that I never would have. The guy who runs it, his name's Andrew Wiley. He's called the Jackal, and when I put jackals in this book, I did think of Andrew Wiley a little bit because I was like, I wonder if he'll like that if he ever sees this. And he actually did see it, and he liked the book, and he loves the book. So the agent, her name is Jen. She's from Brooklyn. She saw the book within days. She called me up, and I just remember saying, Bill, I can't believe it, Bill. And there wasn't like I really wanted to represent you or something like that. That was like already done in her mind. and I was like, yeah, you can represent me, no problem. Again, keep in mind, this book had been rejected, like I'd say about 100 times from different agents. I'd written so many query letters, and people, when you try to explain the plot, like Peter did a great job explaining the plot. It sounds just like crazy, I saw one person called a bag of crazy, and I don't blame people for thinking that, so I'd always been told you only need to find one agent and one editor who loves it. That's all you need. You don't, there's a million editors, there's a million agents. You just need one, one of each, and so Jen. She had a deal within like days, and she called me up. I was taking my son Toby to cello practice on I-78, and I just started crying, I was driving down 78, and I just was crying because it had been so long since I've worked on this, and I had worked really hard, I'll tell you that. That's the one thing I'll tell you is to do something like this, I worked so hard. It was a lot of work, People are like, well, was it that much? Yeah, it was that much work, It really was. And it was, at times it was nightmaric. And, I think my faith increased because of the having to do the novel. I turned more to God, and, for me at least, it was kind of a spiritual experience. The story I told you is, the part that I read is almost exactly what really happened when my family visited my grandfather's grave in England. His grave's lost, and I felt so angry about that and so sad that I feel like I still feel that real anger, and fury and rage about it. But I think the thing is with those kinds of things, as an artist or any kind of creator, you channel that stuff, if you can, and because it'll kill you if you don't, And so for me at least, one way to deal with that kind of that feeling of placelessness of having a family that just got swallowed up by the earth, was to write about it, and so that was part of what this was about. So that I guess the last thing I'll just say I've never experienced the kind of heavy news coverage that ever in my life, anything even remotely. I've worked as a newspaper reporter. I worked on some big papers. I've done interviews. I've interviewed rock stars and things like that. But it's very different to be on the other side of the clipboard or whatever, the notepad, and it was very uncomfortable. That experience. I'm glad that it's winding down now. I genuinely am kind of glad, because I want to kind of get back to just writing and my ordinary life. You have all kinds of people, reach out to you, but with literature, it's fairly quiet, And the one thing I wanted to talk a little bit about was that you have people who love you that you never knew about, and then you also have people who hate you, which I never. It's a very strange experience. You have people who, you have bloggers who want to kind of try to make a name for themselves by, going after you, and that is very not something I expected, and you're not ever prepared for, And I would say that anybody who's in the public light, in any big way, you're going to get people who don't like you. And I'm always like, if whoever doesn't like me in the room, like I want that's the person I want to like me. And all the other people who like me, I'm just like, so what, And so, when to have that magnified, a million times or whatever, it's a kind of shocking experience. And, that's something I've had to kind of learn to kind of grow up a bit, and one thing I've learned to do is to, and this will sound incredibly vain, for a long time when the book first came out, I was Googling it every day, like, Night of the Animals, Bill Broun, Google, Night of the Animals, Bill Broun, who's reviewing it today, where is it now, who says something nice about it. But then, I'd hit like one of these like poison blogs, I think one woman called my book a pile of poo, and said that I was the #1 example of white male mediocrity in the country right now. So just in case you're wondering who that is, and I took that stuff real hard. I took it really hard. I was really devastated. I was crying. I was like, I felt really depressed. I was, had to go talk to people about it. The publisher, I called up my editor and I was like, I've failed you guys. I'm a failure. And they've been through this a zillion times with all their, writers, and they were just like, what are you doing Googling yourself? Okay, stop that now. You're not going to do that anymore, And so basically, you set up a system. You have people. They'll tell you anything that's important to know, and otherwise, you kind of have to go on with your life, and stop paying attention to what people think about you, because it'll kill you for sure. And so I think I've gotten better at that. That's one thing that I've learned. The book is about releasing animals, and it's about the danger of that, And I do think it's relevant to our time. We're in a time where I brought this one quote I just wanted to show you guys. It was if I can. It's going to switch on. It's from a philosopher that I really love. Now I don't know what to do. I hope it's this. Okay. His name is Walter Benjamine, and this is where a little bit of the intellectual part of the colloquium. It'll get darker. But poor Walter Benjamine was writing philosophy that I consider, for me at least, is some of the most important philosophy of the last century. and he was writing it at a time when Nazism was on the rise in a big way, and he was consumed by it. He was essentially forced to commit suicide to escape being put into one of the death camps, and his brother was, put into a concentration camp and murdered. He survived, and art is a wonderful thing. Self-expression is a wonderful thing. But we live in a time now that, and this is something that Walter Benjamine wrote about, we live in a time now when, anybody can put anything out there on the internet. Students, children, adults of all, graduates, and that's a big thing, both for people who work in the media or in communications of any sort. We're liberated in some ways, but it can be very dangerous too. And I think the thing that I really liked about Walter Benjamine was how he was interested in how expression isn't always safe. Expression in sort of mass quantities reproduced can be pretty dangerous. Think of like the pageantry of the Third Reich. Think of the art of the Third Reich. My novel is partly about the creation of art. It's about when you unleash what's inside of you, it can be a dangerous journey. And for me, I think it has an ending that's positive, but it doesn't always end that way. And the thing that Cuthbert finds is Cuthbert finds God, and in one way or another, I have to say. And for me, that was my answer, But I thought it was very interesting, and especially now, today, and think of where we are now, and in September, a couple months away from an election, and there's one of the sort of bits of rhetoric that we're hearing a lot is, we just finally want to be able to say what we're thinking. We want to say what no one ever lets us say. We just want to have a chance to, someone's finally saying what we've never been able to say. But sometimes, that's a pretty scary thing too. So anyway, I think I'm gonna stop there and see if anybody has any questions or anything like that, or anything that you want to ask about the novel writing process, about the novel itself. I'm very happy to answer. Yeah.
You don't speak like someone who was raised in Great Britain. Did you spend a great deal of time there as a youth, or did you just do your research about the setting by remote from here?
Well, I did do a lot of remote research for sure.
We're recording this, so I'm going to repeat the questions that you asked. And the question was, well, the statement was that Bill here doesn't sound like he's from Britain, right? Did I capture that? Okay. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, great. That's a great question. I did live over there for about 5 years, or actually 4 years, and I did start the book when I was over there. But my big, research is my father's English, so I'm a dual national, and I was also, he was someone I talked to a lot too about this, the sort of mythology and kind of folklore of the area of Britain that he's from. So it wasn't just like a passive kind of thing. I interviewed my father. He's thanked in the back, and that sort of thing. And I talked to a zillion people. I did a lot of, calling up Britain, and calling up people there. I joined forums. I joined I was a very active member of a soccer forum for a long time, and they kind of got mad at me because they were, I didn't really know soccer that well. They'd be like, "Why do you?" They were really nice guys. So there's a lot of that too of kind of different kinds of research. you can get lost in the research, you know. But I looked up books on dialect. I studied books from the 19th century that had, you know, encyclopedias of dialect, books that, you know, hadn't been taken out of the library for like 50 years, you know. So I really did a lot of that kind of thing.
More questions?
As was previously discussed, I know Cuthbert isn't like the typical or most desirable main character, but like where did you get some type of background for him, or what made you come to choosing him as like the perfect character for your story?
The question is, where did you find the background for Cuthbert, and how did you choose him as the protagonist of your story?
Okay, well that's an incredibly important question, and the answer is so complicated. I could talk to you for hours about that, Denise. I mean, immediately I had become friends through some volunteer work with a number of men in Houston, Texas, who had schizophrenia, and I'd had relationships with them that lasted several years, and I got to know a lot about their lives. That interested me a lot. A lot of people I met in London, when I lived in London, Cuthbert is very similar to. I have a friend Clarence there who he talks almost exactly like Cuthbert. So there'd be like little things like that. He's a real composite of all kinds of different heroes. Plus there were some stories in the news. There was a man in the early 90s. I've talked about him a lot in the news stories about this novel, who jumped into the London Zoo's lion enclosure, and he had schizophrenia, and he brought he had a religious agenda. He thought that he was serving a kind of religious purpose, and he was mauled. He did survive, and his father actually became an activist to help people who are mentally ill on the streets. Like a lot of times they don't get the care that they need. That's been a perennial problem in our society. So that's the short answer.
Yes. My question is, what things did you have to change when you rewrote the novel? You said about 3 times, I believe it was.
The question is, what things did you have to change when you rewrote the novel?
Well, probably the biggest thing is I made a science fiction. The first draft was not science fiction. It was set in the 70s and the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. And so I moved it into 2052. That was the biggest change without question. And my motivation was just like, honestly, I was just starting to get desperate. And I was like, what the hell is going to sell? You know, it's like, let's make science fiction. Let's see if that sells. You know? I mean, honestly, that really is kind of what happened. I felt desperate, and I was willing to try something new that I'd never done before. I like Philip K. Dick a lot. I like the science fiction writer Philip K. Dick a lot. I like Ray Bradbury a lot, and so I like science fiction already. And I want to do something that I would enjoy, you know, because you have to enjoy writing for, you know, something if you're going to write for many years. If you do a novel, you better really like what you're writing about, because you need to stay engaged for a long time. Eugene, you had a...
Yes, you already mentioned Ray Bradbury. As the author of a dystopian novel, you probably couldn't help debating or agreeing with some of your famous predecessors. Could you tell us to what extent, if any of the famous dystopian novels informed their thinking?
The very last part I didn't hear. Just the very last part of your question.
I heard it.
Oh, okay.
Okay, Eugene asked, oh God, I totally forgot what he said. Can you name any of the dystopian authors that influenced you?
To what extent any of the dystopian novels influenced your book?
Okay.
Influences.
Okay, and well, my influences are, you know, they're certainly, I would say science fiction was the least of my influences. I would say probably the biggest influences on my prose style, I would have to say Nabokov. Vladimir Nabokov, the Russian-American writer. I would read everything that he wrote. I loved his ornate sort of style. I learned so much from Nabokov. I like Raymond Carver, the American social realist. Toni Morrison is a huge influence because she does this thing in Song of Solomon. It's a novel, Song of Solomon. That novel for me is like, it's like the perfect novel. I just can't, you know what I mean? It's like one of those ones that's like the Beatles of music. And she does this thing with a song in that, that becomes this song that stretches into this kind of mythical hymn. And I really use that as a concept in Night of the Animals, because there's a phrase that gets repeated, a kind of magical phrase that gets repeated. In science fiction, Philip K. Dick, the American, he was an amphetamine head writer, and who died in around 1980, I think, 80 or 81. His book became the basis for Blade Runner, one of his novels, and so many of his stories have been made into movies. Minority Report, Paycheck. There's like a zillion of them. It goes on and on. And then Lord of the Rings. I love that, even though I don't like the writing style. I like the breadth of the world and the fantasy world. And Tolkien was from an area that is close to where this novel is set. And that mythology in Tolkien, I was very aware of, and I thought about as I was doing research in West English folklore. So.
Back there?
So your protagonist has an obvious empathy for animals, and I was just wondering if that's part of you, or if you chose that as opposed to, say, him helping a marginalized group of people, right? Like animals.
Okay, why did you choose animals? Do you have an empathy for animals yourself? Does that capture it, basically? Okay.
Again, one of those, a great question. One I could talk a lot about for a long time. I don't think I have a special empathy for animals. I think in some ways I'm probably much less sort of animal sort of loving than most of you, I would say. Although we do have a dog, a cat, and we have a bunch of marine animals, and but I went hunting when I was young, and I teach environmental literature, but I really I'm sort of pro hunting. I'm against like sort of wasteful trophy hunting, but I do. There's all kinds of things that I would say mark me as not like someone who's especially empathetic towards animals. I believe that they have souls. I really believe that. I do. I don't know where to draw the line of bacteria count, or that's your area. But I believe they have souls. I do believe that. I think if you die and you go to heaven, that there are going to be dogs and cats up there, and monkeys and all sorts of things. And so I don't know if that answers. Denise?
During the writing process, how many times would you say you put the book down and thought over it, and for how long?
How many times did you put the book down and thought about it, and for how long during your writing process?
Great question. I quit when school started, and I would start again when winter break began. I would stop at the end of winter break, usually with about 2 weeks of hangover at the beginning of every semester. I would be writing into September, and then I would have to stop because things would get too busy, But when the holidays come, I'm like a priest going to mass. You know what I mean? It's like I go every single day, and I take it really seriously. And sometimes there's tension at home because I'm really protective of the time. And my wife is also an artist. She's a poet, and she wants her time too, and hers is no less valuable than mine. So we have to kind of do a lot of balancing, and horse trading, and that sort of thing. And we also have to pay for childcare, a lot, So because of that, Toby speaks Spanish fluently. He's actually, he's been. He doesn't. He's mad at me now. Peter, I saw Peter.
Call on our student first.
Oh, okay.
Becca.
You said you submitted to a bunch of agents. Were you ever going to go towards like self-publishing? Was that ever like an interest of yours, or were you determined to stay in more traditional publishing?
Okay, the question is, were you ever tempted to go to self-publishing, or did you want to stay in the more traditional commercial publishing?
Yeah, I did not want to go self-publishing. I thought about if I was like on my deathbed, and the book had not been published yet, then I would do that, because then there would at least be a way to preserve the manuscript. But having had it happen now, I feel like, there are some sort of genres where I think it can make a little more sense, like especially in some kinds of genre fiction, because the traditional market isn't necessarily that lucrative for some genres. But I do literary fiction, which is not lucrative at all. And the thing I can tell you that's really great about traditional, just like regular publishing is, and I know I've talked to the class about this a little bit, but you get all kinds of support that is impossible to get if you're self-published. You have a promotional team. The editing help that you get, like you get people who not only who get deeply involved in your book, who teach you about what you're even doing. You have some of the smartest people I've ever met in my life work for that. I have to say my editor, I actually think she's the smartest woman on earth. I actually really think that. Maybe below one step below Toni Morrison. But she's super smart, and I've learned so much from her. And you get that, plus you get money, and that can be helpful because it can buy you more time. They do things like submit things to contests. They continue to support your book. That said, like I meet self-publishers who sell hundreds, thousands of books sometimes, but it can mark you out because if you don't, I'll tell you what, if you self-publish, you better be successful, because if you're not, that becomes a track record, and your publishers and agents in the future are going to be like, well, how well did you sell your book? Oh, it didn't sell very well? We don't want you then, I've heard that. I don't know if that's exactly true, but Peter?
We have time for two more. Peter?
If the book were to be made into a movie, there'd not be obviously things that are exciting about that, but would you be somewhat also reluctant to take this thing that you've created and hand it to someone else and they're going to do something else with it?
Would you be reluctant to hand your book to somebody else, for example, someone to make a movie? That about right? Yeah. Would you be reluctant to hand it over to somebody else, your book?
Nope. No, I don't really. Honestly, I don't. I mean, if something happened that was really disturbing, if it came out to be really disturbing, I could see that. But there has been a lot of interest from Hollywood, but I don't get any. Nothing's happened yet, and I imagine that the offers that have come in haven't been high enough for the agent, and she's basically sent him packing because she wants. It's not worth it to her, because once the rights are gone, they're gone forever. And but yeah, I don't care. Just get me in the movies,
Okay, we're out of time. Thank you so much, Bill. It was a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Before we go, I want to announce our next event in our series. What does that say? Oh, here we go. The undergraduate research, why does it matter? What does it look like? And how can students get involved? That's by Olivia Carducci, Bonnie Green, Jay Hunt, Robert Marmelstein, and Jerry Ross. That's October 5th from 5:30 to 6:30 in Strat Hall 117. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.